everyone. If I could have your attention. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see a packed house for what is hopefully a very lively discussion of this panel, the WTO with the United States, ? My name is Scott Lincecum. I'm the Vice President of General Economics and Trade at the Cato Institute, which, for those of you who don't know, is a free market think tank in the United States. And I'm thrilled to be joined by an all-star panel for today's session. Starting from the far right, James Backus is adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, former founding judge, chairman of the WTO body. Jim also served as a member of the United States House of Representatives, as a U.S. trade negotiator, and he's author of several books, including his most recent work, which he's been signing on stage, Democracy for a Sustainable World. Next to Jim is Cecilia Malmstrom, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, visiting professor at the School of Economics and Law at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. She previously served as European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019, representing the EU at the WTO and other international trade bodies, negotiating bilateral trade agreements with several countries. She also held several other government positions, but we'll move on, and then finally, to my left is Matthew Wilson, ambassador and permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations, WTO, and other international organizations here in Geneva. Ambassador Wilson has more than 25 years' experience in trade and development, and is the chair of the WTO Working Group on Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprises, and the coordinator of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific ACP Group in Geneva as well. So with that out of the way, and before we get to the panelists, I thought it'd be good just to set the stage a little bit about where we are at this moment, because it really is a crazy and historical moment in terms of global trade policy in the United States in particular. Before we get to where we are right at this moment, though, I think it's good to step back just a little bit, way back 8 years ago, to the first Trump administration, which at the time we thought was radically deviating from accepted trade norms in various ways, with steel and aluminum tariffs, washing machine and solar panel safeguards, large amounts of U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports. That, along with retaliation from foreign governments, court litigation as well. It was a pretty big deal, but the effects, while significant, were relatively narrow and targeted. We then transitioned to the Biden administration. Now, the Biden administration mainly kept a lot of those trade policies in place. Somewhat surprising, those of us in the States that thought we might see somewhat of a shift, particularly here at the WTO, but also with respect to tariff policy and the rest. But instead, really, we got an extension in a lot of ways of the first Trump terms. Tariffs remained in place. The administration defended these tariffs in courts in the United States, and really, without reforming the U.S. trade laws that are now we're seeing today, really set the stage for Trump 2.0, which made Trump 1.0 look like child's play. Of course, we start with the tariffs, which are truly radical in three ways. First, the sheer size and scope of U.S. tariffs. We went from an average U.S. tariff rate of around 3% to now one of 15%, maybe 20%, depending on how you measure. New national security tariffs on automobiles, as well as copper and wood products, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, and other things perhaps coming in the very near future. Then we got global tariffs under emergency presidential powers applied under the guise of reciprocity, but really are not very reciprocal at all. It's just a lot of U.S. tariffs getting that average rate up. And then the speed of this. The Trump administration, in mere months, achieved far more than it achieved in an entire 4 years in Trump 1.0. So I have noted about 10 times the amount of tariffs done 10 times as fast. Truly radical stuff. The law was also radical. Instead of using trade remedies or other accepted measures, we had these emergency measures using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which essentially, if you believe the White House, puts a little tariff switch in the Oval Office where the president can turn tariffs on and off anytime he wants for whatever reason, as long as he just declares a national emergency that the courts he does not want to actually judge. This was, again, a radical departure. Outside of tariffs, we had really an abandonment of traditional trade agreements and a move towards trade deals that are very superficial with a lot of details to be determined. But again, really less about reciprocal market access and more about locking in new American protectionism. And with terms that just kind of evolve as news breaks or as the president gets interested again in negotiating with a certain country. And then finally, the uncertainty and complexity of the new U.S. tariff system and trade policy is really astounding. Trade policy uncertainty measured by various economic analyses is at historic highs, far higher than during the global pandemic, which, as we all know, basically shut down global trade. We have all of this pending court litigation, including a very important case at the United States Supreme Court right now, challenging those emergency tariffs. And, of course, things are constantly changing. One day it's India, the next it's Brazil, the next day it's national security, the next day it's derivatives of steel products. Trade policy uncertainty is an all-time high, and so is the complexity of the tariff system. We've moved very quickly from a relatively simple system based on the most favored nation principle with some reciprocal free trade agreements and a reciprocity underlying it all to a highly complex system with overlapping tariffs that vary by country and product, that have content rules and transshipment rules and more and more and more. You get to the point, quite seriously, where you can ask two customs brokers the tariff treatment of the exact same product at the exact same time, and you will get two wildly different answers. So the people paid to do this for a living have no idea how to do it. It's truly crazy times. So that brings us to the subject of today's panel: what to do about all of this, and what does the future hold? And here I'll set out three questions that I think we just don't know the answer to yet. First, how durable are U.S. tariffs? How long will they last? Well, certainly we expect them to last through the Trump administration, depending on what the Supreme Court does. But what happens after that? What happens to all of these trade deals as well? Revenue, the tariffs are raising a lot of revenue, about $30 billion every month. The political elite in Washington seem to have bought into economic nationalism as a way to win national elections. But on the other hand, we are seeing signs of real economic pain from these tariffs and other measures. And the voters in the United States, contrary to conventional wisdom, really aren't into them. The voter support for tariffs is actually a minority position. Even the president's most eager supporters many of them are skeptical of this approach. So that's the first question. The second is, how will multinational firms and global supply chains deal with all of this? Will there be a substantial reshoring into the United States? Well, maybe. We've heard some of that. But also by raising costs and uncertainty, we're seeing some companies moving offshore. We're seeing declines in foreign direct investments. So we just don't know how it's going to go. And then finally, how will foreign governments and international organizations react? Will governments simply move on without the United States? Will they proceed with engagement? What happens to the WTO when you have the MFN principle under such attack by such a large and important member of the global economy? And with that, with those questions, I'll now turn it over to a very easy answers by Gemma. So just to lay out, are we seeing durable policy, and how should we respond to it?
Thank you very much, Scott, for that excellent overview. I very much appreciate being asked to be on this Cato panel and being a part of Cato as well. I am from the United States of America. At the same time, for Scott mentioned, I have the letters WTO tattooed on my forehead. I am a free trader, and I'm not one of those free traders who says, I am a free trader, but. I have a long record of supporting free trade, and I would argue I have an equal record in supporting the international rule of law in free trade. And I have a message today for 165 of the 166 members of the WTO. That message is, stop letting the United States of America push you around. Stand up for your rights under the WTO treaty. We have a saying in the United States that I think is sometimes echoed in other languages: use it or lose it. This applies to national constitutions, but that's not our topic today. It also applies to the WTO as an institution, and I would emphasize also WTO dispute settlement. The actions that have been described by the Trump administration almost entirely violate the WTO treaty obligations of the United States of America. A couple of weeks ago, the government of Brazil exercised its rights under the WTO treaty and filed a case against the United States of America here in WTO dispute settlement. The legal claims of Brazil, in my view, a perhaps educated view, are open and shut legally. There is absolutely no way that Brazil should lose this case. The United States of America is offering a national security defense. The U.S. defense is laughable. The real question is not whether Brazil should or will win this case. The question is, why is Brazil alone bringing a case against the United States of America? There are a small handful of WTO members who have refused to bend the trade knee to Donald Trump. China is notable. Canada is notable. There are very few others. We have watched as the United Kingdom, the European Union, and other countries that should have been standing up to the United States on behalf of the entire institution have bent the knee and brought out a few royal carriages to entertain the visiting potentate. Use it or lose it. If the members of the WTO do not start standing up for their treaty rights and defending the international rule of law, we will never, ever have it again. I spent a decade here along with some very fine jurists, many of them now deceased, establishing the international rule of law with the support of all the members of the WTO, our proud achievement. The United States of America, which helped create that achievement, is now throwing it away, and all the rest of you are letting them. For years, you sat around mulling over how can we appease the United States on the appellate body. What do they want? How can we give them what they want without totally destroying the system entirely throwing away all we've accomplished. Your problem has been that the United States of America wants to be the judge and jury in its own cases. It wants to uphold WTO rules only when they are violated by someone else. It wants to have utter latitude, complete discretion in choosing when and whether it will uphold WTO rules on its own. This is unacceptable. This cannot be allowed. But it will continue to happen, and the United States of America will ignore WTO rules and ignore the WTO itself if you 165 members continue to allow it to happen. My message is clear today. Brazil is right. Join Brazil as co-complainants in its case. Bring cases of your own. Only a small fraction of the imports in the world are by the United States of America. The overwhelming majority of imports in the world are by other countries. Together you can stand up against the bully. Individually you will fall, and so too will the WTO. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Jim. Cecilia.
Everybody, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. Thanks for letting me come after you. As a European, I think we have said, and you alluded to it, Scott, as well, that for the last decade we have seen a gradual non-engagement by the US in the WTO. And a lot of criticism. Some of that criticism has been valid, and all members of the WTO are aware of that, or most at least, and trying to see how it can be reformed. The lack of transparency, the lack of modern rules, the incapacity to make decisions. The list is rather long. Under Trump 1, and you referred to that, there were actually some attempts to reform the system. As the EU worked together with Japan and the US, we to update the try to look at what could be done. We went rather far. We never accomplished the mission, but some things happened. Together with the US and a few other countries, we also took some initiatives to improve the transparency rules within the US, within the WTO. So there were a few attempts, and I think they were seriously meant by the US. Now, of course, since the election of President Trump the second time, it's been much more difficult, and he's really shaken the whole trading system. And we might not agree that tariff, this beautiful word in the dictionary, is the most frequent used word in my vocabulary, at least the last 6 months. And it has become very difficult as well, because you have different kinds of tariffs, you have national security coming in, you have geopolitical pressure coming in. We don't like the way you treat my friend president in a certain country, so you will get high tariffs. We don't like VAT rules, green rules, tech rules, or whatever, and we don't like how you deal with border control, with fentanyl, etc., so there will be tariffs. And this has, of course, made the whole thing very, very difficult. So the EU made a deal, like most countries. Is it a good deal? No. Is it a beautiful deal? No. Should the EU have been tough? Yes. We have this deal. And I think it's important for those of you who are not European to remember that there is something in Europe that is over everything else than tariffs, and that is the terrible war going on in a neighborhood in Ukraine. So Ukraine and the eagerness to try to keep the US engaged in that conflict and helping Ukraine and putting pressure on Russia is an overwhelming reason that the EU has been weak in this and others. So it's important to remember that is the most important thing over now. And then there were a lot of other considerations. We can come back to that, but Ukraine is very important to understand that. Now that deal is not a good deal because it's not reciprocal, and it's still not a formalized deal. It's not really a deal, actually. It's a sort of memorandum or content. But the EU has tried to formalize it when it comes to tariff tariffs on certain goods and increasing TRQs on certain agricultural products as well. That is now with member states and the European Parliament, so it has to be voted, it has to be confirmed. We'll see how that goes. But the ink had barely dried on the agreement, which is not an agreement, before there were new demands. We don't like your tech rules, we don't like this and this and this, and you must impose new tariffs on China and India, because so it's really hard to know where it stops. And the fact is today we have the highest tariffs, the transatlantic tariffs, in 70 years. And that's a very bad thing. What we should do is to abolish these tariffs. They were low in March, and now they're 15 on average. Well, 15 is lower than 30, but very much higher than 3, 4 on average. So it's not a good outcome from our point of view. And then you have all the WTO so what's next? I think that's what to focus on this panel. Well, I think the EU will keep on talking and keep on sort of paddling and navigating. Let's see if it passes the member states and the European Parliament, but there will be new demands all the time. The EU has to do its own homework, we have a long list of reforms expressed in Letta reports and Draghi reports to create more growth internally, to reform the internal market, to increase our innovation, productivity, and so on. That's our homework. And then we will seek, and that is also on its way, so risk from the US. Transatlantic trade is important. We trade for 4 billion euros every day. Sustains millions and millions of jobs. That will not disappear, and that is good for our citizens, that's good for our companies, that's good for our relationships. But it will have to be sort of revisited in certain ways, and companies are doing that. Individual companies are actually quite agile when it comes to acting, because trade will find other ways. It will be complicated, it will be expensive, it will be cumbersome, not least with the different customs clearances that needs to be done. But it will find ways. So big firms are trying to regionalize, they're trying to de-risk, they're trying to increase their resilience when it comes to the supply chains. For smaller companies, it's of course less easy, but they will try to do that. So we will try to seek new friends. We have free trade agreements with a lot of other countries. We are seeking to increase that number with Mercosur countries, with Mexico agreement, negotiated with India, Indonesia, Australia, approaching the CPTPP countries, seeing if we can do things together. And of course, and I'm ending with this, trying to see what can we do in the WTO, because I fully agree with there are 165 other countries in the WTO. Some of them are more reform-oriented than others. That's we all know that. But there are lots of things actually working in the WTO. So they should, let's cherish what works. Let's see what can we do when it comes to reform, both institutionally, but also moving forward in smaller groups of like-minded countries, plurilaterals. If the US want to join later, fine, let them come. If they don't want to join, well, we should move on, because the trading system is so important, and we cannot let one or two or some countries spoil it. I think if we show that WTO actually has values, and many American companies know how important WTO really is, and that the rule-based system is easy. We should keep on working in that direction, and then I come back to some of your questions later. I saw it.
Sure. So Matthew. The developing country perspective, how to approach this issue, because it seems a little bit different. You talk about the rules with the EU and Japan, Korea. Well, how do developing countries?
Do you ever get the feeling you've wandered onto the wrong stage? That's kind of how I feel right now. But listen, I want to give away the plot of the movie at the very beginning. I do not want a WTO without the United States. Frankly, I do not want a WTO without Senegal or Samoa or St. Lucia or El Salvador, because the strength of this organization is that we're all here together, not just making rules, but discussing. And that's incredibly important. So I do not want a WTO without the US. Now, it would make the WTO less effective, less impactful, and frankly, far less dramatic. And I'm not the only developing country that feels that way. Frankly, I would be surprised if there's anyone in my constituency, from CARICOM to the ACP, who wants a WTO without the US. So my central premise is that we need to figure out how to re-engage the US. Although, to be clear, I have not really seen a disengagement of the US in here. Maybe they have not taken positions that others would like, but they have been engaged. If it wasn't for the US, we probably would not have had the trade facilitation agreement. They were front and center on the fisheries agreement. They do engage. I want to recognize that. But clearly, we are not going to have the WTO that we had 30 years ago. We're not going to have the WTO of the DDA. Frankly, we're not going to have the WTO of October 2024. So we need to start wishing for something that will not come back and start to put a little bit of realism on what the next steps are going to be. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. Sometimes extremely uncomfortable. But something that we have to do together with the US at the table. I think we can be both production and consumption economies, and the WTO is the way to do that. And I want to recall something that my former boss, Pascal Lamy, said actually just 2 days ago. He says, the trade system will adjust. There will be dislocation, there will be efficiency losses, but it will readjust. And just like Cecilia just said, trade is like water. It will find its way to flow to other less resistant markets. So we want to continue the dialogue, and we want to have a diagnosis free of the white noise and the narratives and the conjecture, because only then can we seriously start to think about real reform. So now, when the unilateral tariffs were first announced, Scott, I had a lot of WTO members approaching me. What are you going to do? Why aren't you saying anything? Are you scared? Eventually, I had to tell them, listen, we're not scared. We're just being strategic. We need to sit back and see where this thing is going to land. Yeah? And now we see where it's going to land. That many of those countries who were coming to the ACP saying, why didn't you speak up, have gone and done these deals. So I'm waiting with bated breath to see if we're going to find any of these deals on the agenda of the CRT. See if we're going to really do some analysis and assess whether or not they meet substantially all trade, whether or not they meet, I'm curious to see what the next steps are going to be. So I throw out that kind of gauntlet to my dear friends in the UK, the EU, and others. That said, don't get me wrong, I understand why you did what you did. And Cecilia just said it very clearly. There are other considerations at stake here. So I appreciate it. We all want good deals, but the next step have to be about how we make these kinds of deals align with the system of multilateralism. We cannot act as if they don't exist. We cannot act as if there are not going to be more unilateral deals that may have less to do with market access and more to do with other things. So we need to start being realistic, figure out how are we going to align the realities of today with the multilateral system that we want, which means, unfortunately, there's some things we may have to give up. But for us, in the developing countries, I have to say, we're seeing this a bit as an opportunity as well. I mean, if you look at some of the South-South cooperation that has been happening lately, I mean, just earlier this month, CARICOM had a big CARICOM Africa summit in Addis Ababa. It's all about building partnerships. Just yesterday, the IDB hosted an event with Latin America and the Caribbean where we agreed to launch a regional cooperation platform on investment facilitation, because now we realize that the partners that we thought were trusted partners are not. And now it has seriously accelerated our diversification into other partners, other markets. So here, I think that if we do this intelligently, we can actually turn this into an opportunity for developing countries. But just to end, whatever happens next has got to include strengthening the WTO and doing that with the United States sitting with us at the table. Thanks.
Thank you. You know, one of the things you mentioned, we're big fans of trade. I forgot to mention there are 3 copies of our book, Defending Globalization, over there if you'd like one, chapter there and by Jim as well. Feel free to pick one up. But one of the really interesting things has been how governments around the world sort of said, well, okay, the U.S. is doing its thing, so we're going to trade with each other. We're going to sign new agreements. We'll look at plurilateral. So I think that one of the silver linings of this moment is there does seem to be a change in focus that is, quite frankly, I think, good. Panelists, any comments on anybody else's? Jim.
I just want to follow on something that all three of you have mentioned, and that is plurilateral agreements. About dispute settlement. Let me talk now about the rest of the work of the WTO, primarily negotiations. Along with a number of other people who are in this room, Alan Wolf, I see, for example, quite a few others, I was involved in creating the WTO more than 30 years ago. We had anticipated at that time that the Uruguay round would be the last such global all-or-nothing kind of round that would take nearly a decade until we finally got everyone to agree on everything. But what did we do in 2001? We launched the Doha Development Round on the same basis as we had used in the past, without reflection. When in fact, when we created the new institution, we had assumed that there would be an ongoing series of negotiations on new issues, on individual sectors that might be multilateral from the outset, might be plurilateral. As someone asked me the other day, well, what kind of treaty changes would there need to be so that the members could negotiate on a plurilateral basis? And the answer, of course, is none. Absolutely none. What we have now is a very few countries within the WTO insisting on the consensus approach or nothing. And those countries, you know who you are outsmarting themselves and have been for nearly 20 years, because what they have done and what they are still doing is driving members outside the WTO who have additional ambitions into the recourse of concluding plurilateral agreements that are not within the WTO framework. And from this arise potentially competition among trading blocs, geopolitical problems, and a lot more. The right course in terms of negotiation is the one Cecilia set out. It's one Scott and I have argued for a couple of decades, and that is aggressive plurilateralism within the WTO. This can be done now. It can be done without any change in the WTO treaty. It can be done without the United States of America if they do not choose to participate. And I fail to understand why this is not happening. So my message here on negotiations to 165 members of the WTO is to look at the next sentence in the WTO agreement after the sentence that involves negotiating by consensus.
Cecilia, anything to add? Or?
No, I fully agree with that, because independently who sits in the White House, and I think the tariffs, was your first question that I didn't answer, sorry about that. They are here to stay for quite some time, because for the time being, they're bringing in a lot of revenues, and I don't really see anybody saying that, well, we shouldn't do this anymore, not for the midterm elections at least. So they're probably there to last. And there could be anybody sitting in the White House. There has been criticism vis-a-vis the WTO for a long time, but they're not the only one. You said, I mean, this has been discussed for decades. So maybe this could be an opportunity. The US is here. They just appointed a new ambassador who will arrive in a couple of weeks. They do participate in the different deliberations and the committees. Let's move on. With or without the US in the plurilaterals, there are other countries who will not want to join. Fine. But push forward. This could maybe a momentum when you see a good crisis to really start working. Yes, we need to show our constituents, our citizens, our companies that we can do it.
Right. So, along those lines, about the durability of these tariffs, and this is a bit inside baseball, but not really. We have this big Supreme Court case in the United States that is going to determine the legality of these emergency tariffs. It's really the bulk, about 70% of all U.S. tariffs. So, my somewhat informed opinion is it's about a coin toss about how this could go. There are arguments on both sides. But let's just say that the Supreme Court does rule these tariffs to be illegal, invalid. Do we see a change in approach among WTO members, among large governments, among small governments? Are members kind of waiting to see, or do they know, as I've argued, there are other tariff laws out there and they're just going to recreate them, and so maybe there's a brief reprieve, but not much. How are members thinking about that and these emergency tariffs?
I don't know if we are thinking about it, frankly. Like I said, I'm all for realism nowadays. I'm not sure if anything will change too much based on any Supreme Court decision. As you said, trade is like water, but so can tariffs. They'll find a way. Don't think we're focusing too much on that. Frankly, developing countries are focusing on making sure that the WTO continues to deliver. And those who say that the WTO isn't delivering, sometimes I wonder, those are the ones who aren't sitting in the meeting rooms and the hallways every single day. Fine, we're not having multilateral rulemaking, but we just delivered fish 2 days ago. The investment facilitation for development plurilateral was agreed by 96% of the WTO members. Even though it's not yet anchored into the WTO rulebook, many of us are doing our investment facilitation needs assessment and getting on with it. And there's nothing more powerful that shows the relevance of the WTO than the fact that we are still implementing outcomes of the WTO, even though they're not multilateral rules. We're having discussions in here on trade and environment, fossil fuel subsidies, on climate change, on MSMEs, on trade and women, on plastics pollution. So this is not your grandmother's WTO, huh? It is different. So the expectations, I think, have also got to be different. So I don't want people to think that we aren't delivering in here and that everything we're doing is aligned and positioned against unilateral tariffs. No, we are continuing to do what we have to do in here. Now, on the dispute settlement system, I have such respect for those who charted what was really a pioneering piece of work. Don't believe we're going to go back to what was there before. And we have two choices. We can continue to circle in mud by continuing to discuss returning to something that may never happen, or we can seriously start to look at what some feasible alternatives are. And frankly, I am at the point where I want to explore in a real way option 2. Thanks.
On these tariffs, I'm not a US trade lawyer, but I think all of us here will probably follow the deliberations and everything that's happened with great interest. Our popcorn's watching all of the deliberations. But even if the court judges that they are illegal, they're not, they couldn't use IEPA for this, which should be obvious, but maybe not. I think the Trump administration will find new ways. I don't think they will disappear. It's not like we'll get all the money back. It's a very complicated process to follow up as well. So there will be other ways. It will be 232 or 107.
122?
122, yes. There will be other ways. Yes, lots of numbers, lots of acronyms. There will be other ways that he can impose those tariffs. I don't think anybody's really counting on them disappearing because of a court judgment. So we just have to live on and try to do alternative strategies, trade with others, and try to find ways, as Matthew is saying.
Great.
Go.
Yeah, go.
I would like to address Matthew's option 2, because my guess is a lot of members are beginning to feel that way. I am almost old enough now to be appointed to the appellate body. It's taken a while. I'm waiting to find out whether I was one of the founders of the League of Nations of International Law, or whether the WTO will find a way to reconstitute the rule of law in international trade. I am not wed to every word of Article 17 of the dispute settlement understanding. One could change the appellate body. Indeed, several of us have suggested some improvements that have been made there. I see Peter Vanden Bosch in the audience. He and I and quite a few others have some improvements in mind if you want to improve how the appellate body would work. I don't expect it ever to be reconstituted in exactly the same form. It may never be reconstituted at all. But here's my fear. And here's why, at this point, I'm not especially eager to see it reconstituted. And that is because of the continued inclination of members of the WTO to want to appease the United States of America on the issue of dispute settlement. The appellate body was not perfect. Supreme Court of the United States, I would argue, is less perfect than the appellate body, considerably so. No international tribunal is perfect. But the accusations the United States of America has made through its big lie about the appellate body are bogus. They are, in the words of one minion of Donald Trump, alternative facts. The appellate body has done its job according to the rules established for the appellate body by the members of the WTO in the dispute settlement understanding in accordance with the rules of treaty interpretation of public international law. Now, my fear is this. You will appease the United States by establishing some type of political means of dispute settlement instead of a legal means of dispute settlement. And with political means of dispute settlement, the powerful rule. It's the rule of might over right. How can you avoid this? You can avoid this by ensuring that whatever tribunal you have is independent and impartial, and this means independent of all the members of the WTO, including the United States of America. It doesn't mean a system in which a tribunal will render a report that then is subject to redlining by the parties to the dispute, such as the United States was arguing it should have the right to do 2 decades ago. You have to stop toadying to the Americans. While we Americans who still believe in our country fight for our democracy, we expect the rest of the world to support the institutions we have fought and died and bled for, and that includes this one. Because the greatest accomplishment of the World Trade Organization is not that we've freed trade, it's that we've avoided World War III. And at this point, it's not up to the United States government to do what it should be doing, because it won't. It's up to the rest of you to do it. And if you start constituting a dispute settlement system that's political, then the small countries of this world will not have their day or their say in the court of law. They will be rolled over by the big countries, including my own. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
But we have the multi-party, sorry. We have set up a parallel system which is mirroring the existing appellate body, the multi-party interim agreement, interim. Yes, I use it, and there are almost 60 countries who have joined it, and it actually judges in cases, and it is exact, and that has been criticized. That is actually mirroring exactly the existing body that doesn't work anymore, and that's a way pluralism to move forward to try to have disputes. And I read just before the US started blocking the appointment of the judges to the appellate body, there was I think it was done by Bloomberg. They showed that 86% of all the cases that the US has brought to the appellate body, they won.
Yeah.
So it has been very beneficial for them as well.
Right. And
Scott,
of course.
Listen, may you all at one point in your career be geared at such passion by James Bacchus. I loved it.
My hope is that Matthew Wilson will one day be Director General of the WTO.
Here.
That's one sure way to get me recalled, James. No, but I just want to be very clear that I wasn't saying that whatever an option 2 is should be purely political, because I agree with you. But we really need to roll our sleeves up now and think about something that is viable, still anchored in legality, of course, but as you said, James, impartial. Thanks.
So we're going to open up questions in just a sec. I have one more before we get there. And it's about all these deals, sort of deals, websites, whatever they are. So when you look at these, there's a clear imbalance. There's a haves and have-nots. And I think it creates a bit of a collective action problem as well that I'm sure the United States knows as well. But you have big countries, large trading blocs like the EU, that have negotiated slightly better terms. But then you have a lot of other countries, Matthew, a lot of developing countries that just got a letter in the mail. I assume it was the mail. Or they got a tweet or a truth. So there's a huge imbalance between how this is working right now. What is it, how do you rectify that imbalance? Is it in the WTO? Is it through plurilaterals? Or is it something we're just stuck with for the foreseeable, for the next few years? How do y'all think about that?
Well, that remains to be seen. Ideally, and I fully agree with you, all countries should have come together, brought the tariffs to the WTO, and tried to put up a joint front vis-à-vis the US. That didn't happen. Maybe it was never realistic. Now countries have made kind of deals. Some of it is real. Some of it is quite fluffy commitments to invest this and that. How do you measure it? How do you evaluate it? Or buy this and that in and gas and energy and so on. How do you measure that, and how is it even possible? Is there enough energy to sell in that? But they have caused damage because they're not MFN, and we have left a lot of countries behind on this. Can it be repaired? Can we say, okay, we all made mistakes, but can we put them there and still continue within the WTO to try to do reforms? I hope so, but I'm not sure.
I have to say, I would never, if I had the power, I would never have recommended to my group, the ACP, to have immediately mounted some kind of defense about the different unilateral tariffs. Because, on a Tuesday, there's one percentage, on a Tuesday there's another percentage, on a Thursday there's another percentage. So, like I said, you had to wait and see exactly where the dust would fall. And we still don't know where the dust is going to fall. I will say one thing, though. A couple months ago, the US had been talking about putting taxes on Chinese-owned vessels in the region. That would have been absolutely disastrous for small countries in the Caribbean. What my leaders did, along with the private sector, and there's something very important, along with the private sector, singing from the same hymn sheet, went and met with the US and said, here are the implications of what would be if you were to enact this policy, including on you in Florida. They listened. Yeah? So this is why I'm saying we still need to engage. Now, engage with evidence and do it policymakers and business community together, but you have still to engage.
So, Jim?
Just briefly, my strong view is that none of these deals with Donald Trump and his administration are worth the paper on which they are not yet written. He can change his mind in a heartbeat. As Cecilia mentioned already, in the aftermath of the supposed deal between the U.S. and the EU, he's throwing in new things. This makes it doubly disastrous, in my view, that countries have chosen to acquiesce to the United States rather than stand up for themselves, because they've actually gotten nothing for having done so.
I must admit, though, out of morbid curiosity, I'd like to see the WTO analyze these single-page deals. I think that'd be. So with that, let's open it up to questions. We have the mic here. Okay, let's start right down here. Just please wait for the mic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jarosław Pietras, former negotiating in Uruguay on the Polish government, later for the EU institutions, now teaching. You selected me because James Bacchus has signed a book that I am going to read, and obviously. But my question was...
You are helping to pay for my granddaughter's Christmas gifts. And I am grateful.
With pleasure.
Reciprocity.
I'm not aware of this quid pro quo, but anyway.
I was provoked by you on issue of unpredictability and uncertainty. And my question goes a bit longer than tariffs and what we see right now. If you take into account the policies which are right now, they might be changed and so on. But how you can imagine...
You have to keep your
how you
microphone
can imagine the next reform, WTO or any other agreement with the US, where you don't really know whether it will, with the next elections, not change again. For example, Paris Agreement, Obama has signed in, Trump one has withdrawn. Biden has signed in, and Trump too has withdrawn. So the question is a long-term predictability. How other members, including small ones, and that goes to Ambassador Wilson, how can they be sure that once they agree to something, it will be kept for long?
You like to begin?
I mean, we can't. And that means there are two options. You stand still and do nothing, which is disastrous, or you move forward on faith. You know, so in a way, you have to play the long game, and you have got to engage.
Yeah, we always say in the States that the pendulum will swing back eventually, or you have to have faith that the pendulum will swing back. But I would add, there is a role for our Congress to play in all of this. You know, we have a branch called Congress that is supposed to run U.S. trade policy, but the reality is that our laws are too open-ended, too ambiguous, and they provide the executive with too much discretion. And that's why you get a lot of this uncertainty. And both parties have, at times, said they want to reform those laws to get things a little more under control, to provide both economic and legal certainty. And then, of course, their party takes over the presidency, and suddenly those very same reformers go quiet. So it's a bit of a problem, not of a bit, it's a huge problem. But it's one, there is a huge role for our legislature to get back in the game on, for sure.
But also, I mean, all other countries are still in the Paris Agreement, and lots of actors in the US, in states, in cities, companies, organizations, foundations, and so on, are still doing their utmost to try to comply with their Paris commitments. So you know, the US is an important country, but there are like 205 other countries in this world.
Yeah. So next question, we'll go right there.
Thank you. Pablo is here. Two questions, if I may. One for Cecilia. Cecilia, the European Union showed a lot of leadership following the asphyxiation of the appellate body in being the driving force for the MPIA, which is now going on. What happened since? What happened?
I left.
I mean, right now, we had the Biden administration signaling.
That's an accurate answer, by the way.
We had the Biden administration showing some willingness to engage so long as it's a one-tier binding system, and you remarkably saying, no, we don't want to go for it. And then subsequently, every month we see in DSB meetings a proposal that overshoots the 3/4, for example, for an authoritative interpretation under Article 9.2 of the WTO agreement. So you have more than 130 members and still no action, no. Why isn't the EU filling this leadership vacuum and allowing things to move in a direction that would, and this is the question to Matthew, engage with the US in better terms? Matthew, I hear you loud and clear. I think nobody in this room would disagree that we have to keep the US engaged. The question is how to keep the US engaged, because at the moment, it's very cheap as a bargaining to have for the US to do what it wants, to hijack the budget, to bully everybody, while everybody but the US follow the rules. So the question is, isn't it preferable to engage with the US from a position of we're going to take collective action, we want to keep you engaged, we want to work, but we're ready to have a world where 86% of trade is following rules that are predictable and stable, have 14% have completely arbitrary rules, and see where investment goes? Isn't that a preferable approach to just sitting and hope for a miracle that the US will suddenly become engaged?
Matthew?
Barbados is not going to do that. I'm going to be honest with you. We're not going to be the one to say, let's have a WTO without the US. The other 16% be under, non-WTO. We're not going to do that. I'm just being completely honest. But we need to figure out in here what it is we are going to put before the US. And I don't think that we've been able to do that yet. And I guess that's what the whole reform discussion is about. What are the 4 or 5 key elements that would be good, not just to bring the US back on board, but good for the system? Like, I don't think reform should be about making things worse for the rest of us. It's about making the organization better. And it's probably something that we should have been doing 10, 15 years ago, quite frankly, it's been accelerated because we've been forced to do it. So I feel that this could be a possible win-win, understanding, of course, that the nature of multilateralism will change. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we just have to adjust to it and let it adjust to the realities. I don't know. Yeah.
So, question? You're done? Right.
Thank you for the panel. It was a great session. I'm Carolina. I'm a Brazilian lawyer, so I'm very happy you brought Brazil to this discussion. You mentioned the WTO dispute. Brazil has already a dispute in place, and we're trying to negotiate with the United States, but what about retaliation? There was a topic that you didn't touch upon. Waiting for a WTO dispute outcome would take a long time. Negotiating with the US, considering that they're not only pressuring Brazil for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. How do you see the third option, which would be retaliation?
That's a very good question. Here's my view. The same rules apply to everyone, not only including the United States, but also Brazil. Every member of the WTO has, in the dispute settlement, understanding, committed when they face what they see as an unfair trade action, to go first to the WTO and the WTO dispute settlement system for decision before taking any action in retaliation. So if Brazil or anyone else were to retaliate against the United States for its patently illegal acts, in my view, those retaliatory actions would be equally illegal. And I'm pleased to see that Brazil has not taken that course. Yes, dispute settlement takes time. That time can be accelerated to a certain extent. Brazil will want to move faster. The United States will not want to move ahead at all. So that's a challenge, practically speaking. It can take a while to pick panelists. I'm ineligible to be a panelist because I am an American. So I wish you well. The 18 months that you mentioned is, on average, how long it takes. But here's my view. And not only Brazil, but others should do this and do it collectively within the system. The MPIA is great, but you can't use it against the United States because they're not a party to it. Cecilia knows this. And so you have to use the conventional system. And of course, once you win before the panel, the U.S. in its hypocrisy will appeal into the abyss to the appellate body. So you won't be able to get the dispute settlement body to authorize sanctions. So technically speaking, legally, you won't be able to proceed. However, I am at the point where I would say go ahead anyway. And once you have a panel ruling in your favor, I would argue that you have de facto legitimacy. And you could go forward. And what's the United States going to do? Sue you in the WTO? Perhaps. And you could appeal to the abyss. But it will only affect the United States, really, if it's not only Brazil doing it, but a whole group of countries doing it. So what I'm urging again is that other countries join Brazil as co-complainants, not as third parties in support of Brazil, but as co-complainants. So you can join in the sanctions in the aftermath of a victory. And if that collective amount of retaliation could have a real effect on the United States. Plus, if you do this collectively, then Trump can't single out any one of you to try to pressure. I must say that, to his credit, Brazil has not bent to the pressure of Donald Trump, and I applaud my friends in Brazil for having the guts to stand up to the guy.
The lack of retaliation is something different from Trump 1.0. I think something better, as Jim said. But the other way to retaliate is just to trade more freely with everybody else.
Yes, yes.
That's better for you. It's achieves somewhat similar effects. It's consistent with WTO rules. So please.
And that too is starting to happen de facto.
Yeah, exactly. It's really been interesting, again, to see that kind of movement. So we have time
Brazilian sales to China, for example. The sorghum farmers in the United States are saying, where did our market go?
Sure.
Thank you. So I'm a graduate student here in Geneva, and just a few years ago I was doing my undergrad in the UK, and all of our studies were kind of focused on China being the one that upset the multilateral system. And we're writing a lot of papers on that kind of subject, and now, ironically, it's the U.S. that's upsetting that system. So I'm just curious, if you could go back 5-10 years, knowing what you know now, what kind of questions do you think we should have been asking or researching?
I mean, the one thing I would say, that a lot of the attention is on the U.S., but we have to make sure that that doesn't divert attention away from others who are also not playing ball, but maybe doing it a little bit more discreetly. So we have to be careful, have a nice lay of the land. I probably would have listened more. The hints were all there. If you really think about it, a lot of what is happening now should not have surprised us. The hints were all there. So I would have listened more, which means why my recommendation is we need to listen now. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just add, you actually started to hear some of the U.S. complaints about the WTO during the Obama years, and certainly a different tone and volume. But some of those things, the length of time it takes to actually for a dispute to come to resolution, lack of compliance with adverse decisions, those types of things, I think if you look back, you can see some of the seeds of potential research in those comments. So, next question. Oh, sorry.
You go ahead first.
No, it's okay. You have the mic.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
My name is Carmine Soprano. I'm an economist at the where I do work on trade among other issues, but I also advise UN agencies as an independent expert, and I'm a lecturer at university. And my speaking as an individual and for the bank. If I can be a little provocative here, I'd say the one merit that the sitting U.S. administration had so far is that they've been pointing their fingers on issues that are economically real, right? I'm thinking about rising inequalities and stagnating wages and loss of manufacturing jobs and the crisis of the middle class, etc., etc. And don't get me wrong, I certainly do not think that trade policy and tariffs are the right way to respond to that, nor I believe that all of those issues are the responsibility of the WTO. In fact, they require often domestic policy of responses. But since this panel is possibly, I believe, also about the reform of the WTO, I'm wondering whether any of your panelists may share something about how they think a reform in WTO may better deal with some of those issues, because the evidence is there that some of those problems can be connected back to the adverse impacts of globalization. And I think it would be interesting to hear what a reformed WTO could do in a more pro-free trade scenario to deal with some of those problems. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your question. I applaud the continued good work of the bank. I was in Oxford in June and heard a prominent professor and WTO expert, a person I admire, say that in being realistic, we should simply accept the fact that the WTO should no longer be about liberalizing trade. That we should allow countries to have a certain level of protection beyond what is legally permitted under their schedules of concessions, and we should provide them with a lot more domestic latitude than we have in the past. I could not disagree more. Freeing trade is a liberation of the world. It's the way to the end of poverty. It's the way to global human prosperity and human flourishing. We should not abandon the cause of freeing trade. There's nothing in the WTO treaty that requires free trade. The phrase free trade does not even appear there, as I'm sure many of you know. But there's no purpose in the system unless it's about lowering the barriers between and among countries to the flow of goods and services, and with them, ideas and innovations, new technologies, new ways of thinking and living and doing. That's what the WTO is about. That's what it must remain about. And no reform of the WTO will be a form worth doing if it undoes any of what the WTO has accomplished over the past 30 years and what the GATT accomplished in the nearly half a century before that.
I think you raise a very important question, and these are challenges that every society is struggling with today, with the growth of inequality, people who are lagging behind, globalization and so on. But trade is not the fault, and trade, well, can be a solution, but it is rather how do you divide the benefits of trade, and that's about tax policy, social policy, and so on. And here, of course, those safety nets that has to be built up, the WTO cannot do that. But WTO can engage in other items that are related to trade and that many people, not least young people, are concerned about. Trade and environment. How can trade contribute to facilitating the circulation of green technology, for instance? There are lots of initiatives here on plastics and on green technology. Trade and health. How can we combine, how can we facilitate the spreading of medicines and vaccines, so on? I mean, there are also some initiatives going on, so that they can do. the trickling down of the benefits is very much a political responsibility, and that needs to be addressed, absolutely, but probably not here. You can share good ideas, but not the core things of WTO.
No, I agree, and this is why I think the partnership approach that the WTO has taken of late is so important. So working with the WHO, working with the ILO, working with the bank, so that you can actually de-silo these issues because they're so incredibly important. And of course, you will never be able to benefit from trade if at the same time at the domestic level you are removing social safety nets from people or cutting important DEI programs that do give people opportunities. It will never happen, so it needs to be looked at holistically.
Yeah, I think there's even a risk if you take on those challenges, then you get even more blame, right? So I think we have time for one more question down here. There was someone who, yeah.
Ellen Wolf.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this panel, which has been just great.
Thank you for sitting through this, Ellen.
A lot to agree with. I came to learn, and I have been learning. Question is one of hope, not monopolized by Obama, but the idea of the hope of the WTO moving forward. The U.S. stepped back quite a while ago. It started losing interest somehow, and no one, collectively, no ones, seemed to come forward to say, well, we're going to get some stuff done here. You talked about plurilaterals. You talked about why have dispute settlement if it's not binding. It has to be binding dispute settlement. You have to have full transparency. Why is it going to be different? I mean, there are a lot of ambassadors who care and have ideas. Tell us why it's going to now come together, why it's going to work. The U.S. isn't going to lead, and you wouldn't want it to right now, unless something catches their fancy, like maybe AI or something that the tech companies really care about. So why is this going to get better?
Sure. Go ahead, Jim.
First of all, let me say a word of gratitude to Ambassador Wolf, Deputy Director General Wolf, for all he has done through the decades to support the multilateral trading system. He is one of the fathers of all that we do. He has been a friend and advisor to me since I was in my 20s, and I am everlastingly grateful. He too is almost old enough to be on the appellate body. Alan, that's the central question. I can only answer from my own vantage point. I first came to what was then the GATT in 1979 as a trade negotiator. That was 46 years ago. I came here having agreed to be appointed to the newly formed appellate body 30 years ago in 1995. I came to Geneva then and to the WTO and the appellate body for two reasons. First, I believe that freeing trade can help liberate humanity. Second, I wanted to prove that there could be such a thing as the international rule of law by helping establish the international rule of law in trade. And during my time and that of my successors on the appellate body, we achieved both, which is why I'm so ardent in defending the dispute settlement system. In the end, it all comes down to political will. And we simply don't have the will to move forward. It's not lacking here in Geneva, it's lacking back in the capitals, where we report if we're ambassadors to the WTO. Why? Because there is a pervasive distrust at the grassroots of the world of anyone in an elite, anyone in the establishment, anyone who's an expert, anyone who is part of an institution, and least trusted of all are international institutions such as the World Trade Organization. I've written a whole new book about what I think we should do about that, and I'm not going to quote all 500 pages today, but I believe that the remedy for distrust is participation. We need not less democracy, but a whole lot more true democracy that provides us with genuine self-rule in which people can participate in making more of the decisions that affect their own lives. And if we have that, then they will begin to trust the decisions of institutions like these once they become truly democratic.
There's this old cliche, never waste a good crisis, but I think it's true. We do have a crisis right now. The world is sort of screaming for common solutions in climate, in health, in trade, in peace. Well, the list is long. And we can do it. I can feel here a clear determination to try to address the issues. If not with everybody at the same pace, okay, let's do it. Question willing popular about these days, but it works. So let's gather us, you, who want to do the reform, let's start. I mean, then others can join as they want to come on board. But I think it is possible. This is a moment. Because if it's not, then when? Then we can all go home.
Right.
I mean, look, people in my generation, and it's great to see you, Ambassador Wolf, people in my generation and the generation, we've never really existed in a world without the WTO. You know, there's no real counterfactual, except for the last couple of months, where we have seen what a world without the WTO could be. War of the jungle. So I think it's caused some of us to wake up. And I think that waking up is going to bring quite a few more of us together to safeguard the system. Maybe there's going to be a time lag, but I can feel the energy happening, and especially developing countries want to make sure we preserve this system and make it stronger. And just to close on my end, there's this quote that I absolutely love, and whenever I see it, I can't help but think about what we're going through right now, and it's from Hemingway, from The Sun Also Rises. And it says, "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. Mike said, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. And that's my concern about what's happening right now.
So with a hopeful concluding note, we're out of time, and I want to thank everybody, our panelists as well. Thank you so much for joining us.